Hey, everybody, welcome again to another episode of the Adult Autism, a Spectrum of Uniqueness podcast. Today, I have a special guest, Sol Smith, who wrote a book called The Autistic's Guide to Self-Discovery. And Sol, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to talk to you not only about the book, but just about your journey, about being autistic and how all that
Mhm.
came about. And I think maybe a good part or spot for us to start is to talk about this book and I think that the first couple of paragraphs in the first chapter, when I read that, I
Uh-huh.
said, "Ooh, man, that would be a real cool way to start off the podcast episode and kind of get us into this discussion about your journey in autism." So, if you wouldn't mind, and if
Awesome.
the
Yeah.
audience doesn't mind, let me just read the first two paragraphs of this book, and then we'll launch into it. So, this first chapter is called "When the Person Who Stole Your Identity Is You." In my early 20s, I was reasonably sure I had it all together. I thought I had learned what I needed and was on my way to some kind of American dream, like success. I had a couple of degrees. I started a job as a professor, and against all odds, I had a wife. This was the moment I had been waiting for. It was time for the curtain to drop. They lived happily ever after to appear. And success to sweep me up like a current into the future, with me eventually winking out as a stellar example. That curtain never came. The end credits should have run, but the days kept on happening. My alarm kept going off, and new challenges kept popping up. Furthermore, I had a sense that this "I finally did all the things, giving me my American Dream Award" moment wasn't the final dramatic crescendo of an orchestrated symphony. I knew this because I was a fake. Wow, what a way to start off the book. Well, how did you come to realize that you were autistic, Soul?
Oh man. How did I come to realize it? I mean,
Yeah,
it was definitely a long journey. I always knew I was a little different, and I guess that's where this notion of being a fake comes from, is somewhere along the way in school, I recognized the importance of getting good grades, and I got good
yeah,
grades, but I really didn't do it by following instructions. I always hated instructions. I didn't like doing things the way that, it seemed to be the right way. I always
yep.
wanted to do it my own way, and a
Hmm.
good example of that is like, I never made a rough draft until after I made the final draft. I'd make the final draft and then I'd make a rough draft and then I'd make an outline. I'd always worked backwards that way.
Okay.
And, it's just how my brain worked. I didn't want to do the step-by-step thing.
Yeah.
And so I hated showing my work in math. I would just kind of like squeeze my eyes tight and work through it really quick.
Yeah.
Um, so it always felt like I was doing things wrong, but that I was getting by. And I was like, man, how long do I have to keep this up? And there's this kind of suggested story in school that, like, oh, you're going to get ready for your life this way, like, go through all these steps and then your life's going to happen. And I kind of
Yeah.
thought that that was like it's this tacit finish line that you get across this finish line and now you get to relax. But yeah, once I started a job, I was like, oh no, I have to keep faking it. Like, how did I not know this? You know,
Yeah.
because, suddenly
Yeah.
I'm lecturing about writing and I'm like, I would think about these other lecturers and they're up there writing stuff on the board and stuff. And I'm going, how would anybody learn how to write by like writing stuff on the board and memorizing notes? My God.
Yeah.
And it
Exactly.
just, yeah. So I just like that just wasn't how I was going to teach. It wasn't going to be that way. And I just knew that it was always going to be a little out of step from everybody.
Hmm.
So I always knew I was different, and I feel like the way that it was framed with my parents, my dad was a brilliant person, most likely on the spectrum, and just he always was very affirming. So I always saw the
Mm.
differences as advantageous, as a
Yeah.
good thing, and so I never really sweated it very much. And I think that that could have gone either way, obviously. But so essentially, I ended up getting a doctorate in education, and
Hmm.
I ended up really loving teaching, but being very critical of the whole situation with grading and assessment, and I
Right.
felt like grades became this, and I'm sure as an academic, this sort of surrogate goal that we think we're giving the students a floor to stand on, but it becomes a sort of ceiling.
Yeah.
That students take a literature course, and instead of turning them on to literature, the it's sort of like, okay, now you've finished books. You don't have to read anymore. And this sort of happens like at every level. And I always thought, well, this is so sad that we're kind of creating this finish line mentality. So anyway, during the pandemic, I decided I would do a podcast, and it was about kind of trying to translate my mindset to students about how
Hmm.
to try and move from this mindset of the school's going to do all the work, just follow the instructions,
Yeah.
to here's how to navigate things in a way that you get the most out of it and you get to invest in yourself while still playing the game of school. And so it was
Yeah.
a sort of, stepping stone approach that was 12 or 14 episodes, sort of stepping stone. And by the end, it just kind of had this, I was really happy with it. By the end of that first season, I really liked what I had laid out there. But I recognized on that last episode that I had made a step-by-step guide about how to think like an autistic person.
Wow.
And
Okay.
I know, yeah. And I was like, oh man, because it was bottom up processing. It was unlearning a lot of socialization. It was taking away the labels for things and trying to see the intrinsic value of things. It was lateral thinking, all of this stuff that autistics do naturally. And I was like, okay, so this needs some looking into. And yeah, got really into it. I ended up getting a master's in psychology because of this, and got
Uh-huh.
diagnosed at the very, very beginning of that. And yeah, I
Wow.
kind of taught myself I was autistic essentially by really diving into how I thought.
That's really fascinating. And when you
Yeah.
first started talking about when you were younger, how you kind of had your own way of doing things, you didn't want to do
Hmm.
things necessarily in the prescribed way. It
Hmm.
reminds me of when I was an undergraduate and I took an English course, and I had this, it was an adjunct professor, and she had a very different way of teaching, something that I had never encountered before, where most of the time, like you were telling me, you come up with your outline for a paper, and then, that kind of step-by-step, real linear type of approach. This person had wanted us to just start to write any idea free flowing. Don't worry about an
Hmm.
outline. Don't worry about any of that. Just start writing. And it was more of like a bottom up instead of a top down approach, which was quite different for me. And that's
Yeah.
really the first time I had been exposed to more of a of a nonlinear way of approaching or thinking about things. And I think that a lot of autistic people can kind of relate to this this mode. But for you, you kind of went through and you got into adulthood where you finally realized, hey, maybe something's going on with me where I'm autistic. How is it
Hmm.
possible for a person like yourself to live well into adulthood, um, realizing that, at that point in time they're autistic, while other people, you hear about the kids who are identified, 18 months old, 2 years old, they're identified as
Hmm.
autistic. How is this that this kind of thing happens? And,
Yeah.
say a little bit
It's
about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, obviously there's the issue of autism being a spectrum, and some
Yeah.
people very clearly need more accommodations than others early on. But on the other hand, we don't assume that other people's internal worlds are so very different from our own. So that's happening, but also you don't tend to connect all of the dots that autism is, because autism is really about having a
Mm,
different kind of nervous system. And with your
okay.
different kind of nervous system, so you don't really look back and go, wow, there must be some sort of connective tissue between how much I hate cotton balls and how much I hate bright fluorescent lights and
Yeah.
my job problems and my relationship problems. These things must be connected. Like you just don't
Yep.
see you know what I mean? Like it's so many different spheres of your being.
Yes.
And we also early on, early on you do see some more visibly unmasked autistics, and we see
Hmm.
them being othered. You see them being treated differently.
Yes.
And we hide it, so we mask, we hide it, we try to be like everybody else.
Yeah.
And from what we know, from looking into autistic versus allistic brains, that autistics are using a lot of cognitive energy to
Mm.
analyze social situations and try to cognitively match what's going on rather than having it
Sure.
be a more hardwired response. So yeah, we've just been basically burning a lot of energy to do that. And essentially one really, we have a better vocabulary now than we did, even 15 years ago. But this really, for a lot of us, I think, hit a breaking point with the pandemic that those of us who were sequestered from society for a few months at a time suddenly were used to the fact that we weren't watching ourselves anymore. We weren't masking, and we were
Yeah.
experiencing this relief of anxiety
Yeah.
from this. And then to hear somebody say, "Oh, I just can't wait to get back to normal." And we're like, "Whoa, what?" I thought we hated that. Like, like you guys liked normal? Um,
Yeah.
like I thought this was our chance to make something new. And
Yeah.
and no, they didn't want new. They wanted worse,
Yeah.
I guess. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it must have felt like a relief not having to worry about any of that kind of stuff.
oh,
And
I
just you
for
could
me it was
finally just
just
kind of be yourself.
it was heaven for me. I have four kids and my wife, and we were having 3 meals a day together. I just loved it. Which isn't to say that people didn't go a little stir crazy in our house, but
Yeah.
yeah, I could have done that all the time. You
Yeah.
know, selfishly,
Well,
they wanted
tell me,
friends.
tell us a little bit about this book,
hmm
and what inspired you to write this.
Well, I knew that I wanted to do it. I had started being a coach, a life coach for autistic and ADHD folks shortly after learning that I was autistic. Well, before my diagnosis even, but shortly after I had been very convinced of this. I had been life coaching sort of as a side gig from
Mm.
being a professor, and
Hmm.
once I sort of saw the application, a lot of my clients were already ADHD or autistic, and once I sort of saw like how I've navigated things, how I was navigating
Hmm.
unmasking and burnout. I saw that as a real whole. That
Yeah.
basically, when you are either diagnosed or you self-diagnose, because about 80% of people who are autistic above the age of 18 do not have a diagnosis.
Right.
That basically there's no treatment, there's no therapy, that there's no roadmap for what to do now.
Yes, exactly.
So nothing really gets better. And so my idea was I wanted to build the roadmap. I was helping people individually with this. And after helping several dozen people, I thought, I have enough experience with myself and enough education and enough experience with others to start building this roadmap. And
Hmm.
so that's when the idea for the book really started taking shape.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Mhm.
I think there needs to be more of that, because it's easy. Well, I shouldn't say that it's easy for a person to get diagnosed. It's possible for a person to get diagnosed,
Mhm.
but even after that, it's like, what now? What do I do with this
Right.
information? And I think that there's a lot. I think for a lot of people who this is really the first time they've actually considered, hey, am I autistic? And they get evaluated, and it's like, yeah, they get the validation that they are autistic.
Right.
And it's like, okay, what does that mean for me? Now I have to kind of look at all of my past experiences through a different set of lens because
Right.
now I
Right.
understand who I was. Oh, now I start to understand why this happened or why that happened. And, it takes a long time. And I think this is a wonderful thing that you're doing because, a guide to self-discovery. I think that that's a great title for that. What are a couple of
Yeah.
important things that you discovered about yourself in your autistic journey?
Oh man, that I discovered about myself.
Yeah.
I discovered that I really have trouble making friendships, and that while I have some friends, very few of them did I make on my own. And so what I mean is that growing up, I made most of my friends through my brother. And
Yep.
then as an adult, I made most of my friends through my wife. And this was easy because it gave me a sort of role to play. So like as the little brother or as the husband, you don't have to get into as much reciprocal
Yeah.
relationship building. There's
Hmm.
already a relationship there. There's a sort of like scaled down expectations. Sometimes you're at the event, sometimes you're not. You don't have to like even any kind of conversation with a friend, from small talk through very deep things, there's this slow buildup of disclosure. And if you're not very sensitive to what is too much or what is too little disclosure, I'm an oversharer myself.
Hmm.
You risk either coming across as cold because you don't match how much they've shared of themselves and how much
Right.
vulnerability they're sharing, or you
Hmm.
come across as a big time oversharer and now you're, doing emotional dumping on people. And
Yeah.
so that's becomes a really kind of hard place for autistics to traditionally build friendships. So I was building friendships through other people, and that role was giving me a lot of comfort. And then as I extended that idea out, I was like, oh, well, that's why I like maybe being a professor, that there's this role that I'm up here and you guys are over there. And we don't have to worry about hierarchy because we're not in competition with each other. We don't have to worry about reciprocation because I'm here to help you and you're here to ask questions.
Right.
And it just gives a very comfortable sort of interaction all day long. So I go home feeling as if I've had something like parasocial interactions, but it's all been very safe. It's all been behind this sense of a role. And so I
Yeah,
just really
the
became,
roles are very
mhm,
well defined in
yeah,
situations like that.
yeah,
And even when you're talking when you were younger, or even now with your wife, when you develop friendships through your brother or through her,
hmm
when you're younger, you're sort of like the tag along. Um, when you're the spouse of somebody, I think in both of those situations, there's not as much pressure placed on you because the other person can kind of take over more of that. And if you have something to
right.
add every now and then, you can, but the pressure isn't on you solely.
Yes, exactly, exactly. You're just sort of a bonus that comes along with the primary friend. And
Yeah.
it just gives you a lot of freedom to act and you're not expected to text and return texts. I mean, every aspect of it, the pressure is eased up. So, yeah, just those type of things. Like, for example, like getting that path between coworker and friend is really difficult for me. When a coworker has asked me to grab a drink after work, I've always been like,
Hmm.
gosh, what would we even talk about? Like, I don't want to talk
Yeah.
about work, and I
Yep.
don't really want to talk about family very much because that feels like it's crossing a line. I had a
Hmm.
coworker, he had tickets to this Moby Dick opera, and I can't think of anything I'd rather go to than a Moby Dick opera, and yet I could not get myself to a mental place where I was going to feel okay going
Yeah.
with a coworker to a social event. And I just had to come up with excuses. And after you do so many excuses, people understand, oh, don't invite him. And
Yeah.
ultimately this really, this feeds into the job insecurity of autistics because you're much safer in a job if you have a lot of friends in a job. And
Hmm.
and it doesn't really matter how well you're doing your job if you don't have a lot of friends. This
Right.
makes you a lot simpler target and people can go south on you much more quickly. It makes things a lot less stable.
I'm sure. Well,
Yeah.
you said that you've done some autistic coaching, and I
hmm
wonder, and this can either apply to yourself or people that you've worked with in your coaching role. Is it
hmm
possible that part of this discovery process, there are things that autistic people may not want to discover about themselves or to
Oh,
learn about?
there's some really difficult things for sure. Some
Hmm.
hard truths.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just for example, you could be hiding from yourself. different sexual orientations or even gender identifications that
Okay.
you have not expressed to yourself, that you've, sort of matched the heteronormativity and
Yes.
then suddenly realize that, like, oh my gosh, I've actually always been attracted to a different gender than I thought.
Yeah.
And I've never given myself the space to see that because I've been so busy trying to fit in. I've been putting so much effort into that. And
Mm-hmm.
then it becomes a really hard adaptation for everyone in your world. And which isn't to say that it's not going to be worth it to you to change, but it's a hard change to make. And
Mm-hmm.
so and then to a lesser degree, I mean, lots of stuff along the way becomes a hard realizations to make. And not
Mm-hmm.
to mention that we have this idea that unmasking is taking off this social veneer, and that underneath it is this true self that you've been hiding. When
Yes.
in actuality, it's like you really didn't fully develop your own unique personality the same way that an allistic does, because they're
Right.
trimming away extra synapses until they
Mm-hmm.
feel a sense of fitting into their personality like a glove. And we instead have this
Mm-hmm.
sort of like vaporous sense that we sort of congeal our personality around people,
Mm-hmm.
and now what we have to do is sort of finish that development. We have to
Yeah.
experiment with things, experiment with ideas until we find the things that move us and motivate us. So there's a lot of trial and error, really, to trying to really discover yourself, because a lot of it you've just left behind in favor of joining the crowd.
I think that in the past, I used to teach a developmental psychology course, and we talked about Eric
Hmm.
Erikson, who had this theory of development, and one part of this stage of development is this identity versus role confusion. And I think for autistic folks, it's I think it's not easy for them to figure out who they are, who they truly are, until they are allowed to, or until they decide that they're going to unmask.
Hmm.
Then it's okay. Now I'm really, and this is part of this whole self-discovery process, I think, is to figure out who am I really? Because
Yeah.
this is the way I am when I'm around people, when I put on the mask to make myself look socially acceptable. But if I take off that mask and then I go and interact with people, what am I like then? How do they respond
Hmm.
to me? And of course, that's all part of identity development too. And I think
Yeah.
that's all a long process too. You know, one of the things that you in the book, the whole aspect of self-care, which is also part of this
Hmm.
self-discovery process, and you hear a lot about that in the autistic, literature and things of that nature. But you kind of talk about self-maintenance, and
Hmm.
what is self-maintenance, and why do you maybe think that that could be just as good as self-care, or maybe even better than the notion of
Yeah.
self-care?
Yeah, well, I feel like the idea of self-care has been, it's been such a buzzword and co-opted by
Yeah.
so many different things, and it sounds indulgent when it shouldn't be.
Uh-huh.
And so I feel like a lot of people are hesitant to prioritize that. It comes
Mm,
across as self-care is what you do once all of your other jobs are done. And I think especially for autistic people, that we need to keep in mind that if we are not maintaining ourselves, we're going to burn ourselves out.
sure.
So it's like you want to make sure that you're getting your oil changed in your car before you're driving 3,000 miles, not just
Mm-hmm.
after. So yeah, I have this idea of self-maintenance is that we are taking in extra sensory stimuli when compared
Mm-hmm.
to other people. Thanks to our different nervous system, we're not filtering as much information out.
Right.
We are thinking, our minds are busier on average. So we have to do things to try and maintain a sense of regulation that's going to
Mm-hmm.
help us with our executive function and help us manage all of that input so that we can responsibly do the things we have to do instead of, you know, making an energy deficit where we stop taking part in stuff that's going to interest us or move us and eventually hit burnout. Because once you hit burnout and you just don't have any motivation, it's really hard to get out of there. So yeah, you really just have to keep maintaining, and this can mean coming up with some form of exercise, some form of mindfulness, some form
Hmm.
of an interest that you are doing for its intrinsic value, so that you're still getting dopamine going no matter what. So you have this like you know hum of energy that you're building that can
Yeah.
build resilience for everything else.
I like, well, two of the things I really like about what you just said there is that I like the metaphor of sort of how you bring your car in for regular maintenance, getting the oil change every, whatever,
Hmm.
3,000 miles. I think that that makes a lot of sense. And I think the other thing that kind of relates to that is that self-care is not really an end in of itself. Really, it does relate more to maintenance, more regular caring for yourself as opposed to something that you kind of reward yourself with at the end of
Yeah.
doing something. Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense. And really some of this relates to the thing I was just about to talk to you about because in one of the last chapters of the book, it's entitled Embracing Authenticity. Why should
Mhm.
autistic people strive to be more authentic? Why is that so important?
I'm I mean, if nothing else, you use a lot less energy if you're being
Yeah.
authentic. If you're less worried about what other people are thinking, how they're perceiving you, how you're coming across, then you're able to silence this internal editor that's always watching.
Hmm.
This default mode network that's so self-critical is about 40% more active in an autistic brain than in a non-autistic brain.
Okay.
So being authentic and it also we seem to be, you know, very attuned to our lives, observing them a lot, and having a need to sort of express our experiences. Um, so feeling like, our authenticity can help us like have that voice, however it is that we want to express our experience, whether it's, either artistically or through journaling or, joining a support group, that really being honest in this and expressing what your experiences are becomes a sort of cathartic process that helps
Hmm.
us to better understand a lot of our internal signals, a lot of the confusion that we're going through. And again, this helps unwind this knot and becomes part of that resilience and part of that self-maintenance.
And I think a good part of this whole process is for anybody who's listening to this or watching this on YouTube is that being authentic, making that choice of being authentic doesn't mean, okay, I'm taking off my mask. I'm just going to be who I truly am from this point on. It's a real process to
Hmm.
gradually take that mask off and maybe by little bits and pieces allow people to see who the real you is. Because I think for some people, especially autistic people who have been traumatized in the past for being who they just truly were, that's a real tall order to get to the point of taking the mask off to being truly who they are. Because what's going to happen when I expose myself, when I make myself vulnerable? What's going to
Hmm.
happen to me? And I think that that's a process, and people should give themselves plenty of time and freedom to do that.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. There's a really moving part in uh, what is it, the book Neurotribes, where he talks about a nonverbal autistic who goes to one of the first autism conferences run by autistic people,
Yeah.
and he has written a speech, and he talks about how hard it was going through all this therapy that was supposed to get it where he was responding in more, quote unquote, normal ways,
Yes.
making eye contact, giving his parents a hug, and things that he was not prone to do. And it was, he said something to the fact that it hurt him so badly that his parents essentially wanted him to die and for another person to be looking out of these eyes back at them. And that
Wow.
just that sense, I know, yeah, that sense that you want me to be somebody else. You want me to be
Right.
somebody other than I am for your comfort,
Right.
can be really overwhelming. And part of this is that we're terribly prone to developing um, really bad coping mechanisms. In absence of the self-maintenance and absence of authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
we're prone to alcoholism, chemical dependency, sexual addictions, eating disorders, gambling addictions, like something
Yeah.
else that's going to become this sort of central part of our narrative that helps us manage things. And that cuts years off of our lives. It's terrible and it's draining. And yet it is a tool that well over 80% of us turn to at some point in our lives. So if we can stay away from that, that like there's nothing harder than for me, I had an eating disorder for years. And then
Mm-hmm.
when somebody, criticizes me as I've been unmasking and says, oh, you're so much harder to deal with, or why do you have to be more autistic or something? And I'm going, well, you liked me better when I had my eating disorder. That's what you're telling
Ah,
me.
sure.
And that's really hard because, and I
Yeah.
think that lots of people can relate to that they, oh, well,
Yes.
you liked me better when I was an alcoholic. We have these feelings and it feels like a type of rejection that is y- it's so hard to wrap your mind around. And this is why, unmasking is really hard around family. It's really hard around old friends.
Mm-hmm.
And it,
Oh,
it
yeah.
asks a lot of them. It really does.
Yeah.
A lot of people end up moving in with their parents um, to do this. Like they've lost their job, they've hit burnout, and their parents are welcoming them home, and that's great. But our parents tend to have a very fixed idea of who they are. Like my 16-year-old, I'm still sure that she wants the drumstick at Thanksgiving because she loved it when she was 4. But she doesn't want the drumstick anymore. And she reminds me every year, and I go, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And it's
Yeah.
sort of like,
Yeah.
and my mom's the same way with me. And so having that fixed notion of who they are makes it really difficult because we
Yeah.
want to please them. We want to meet those expectations. And so I think it's important for the people in our world to understand that who you knew me as was the authentic me at that time. That's who I knew myself as at that time.
Yes.
And now we're changing. Everybody else is changing. Everybody else is free to change. Now we're changing, and I want your support in this and your understanding that it's uncomfortable for both of us. So if you can have that kind of grace with the autistic people in your life, it's really helpful.
I think that's part of the discovery process too, in the journey post evaluation, or for people who just decide that they're going to um, show themselves for who they really are to others. Is the questions: what are they going to think of me? What's going to happen? Are they going to accept me for who I am? I mean, there are a lot of these. I mean, I'm a
Hmm.
recovering alcoholic. I'm not autistic, but I'm a recovering alcoholic. And those questions went through my mind when I was thinking, am I going to tell anybody my
Right,
secret? And what are they going to
right.
say? What are they still going to accept me? And you think about those things, and it's a
Hmm.
big decision to tell somebody,
Yeah.
in your case, I'm autistic or whatever the case might be. Well, what recommendation do you have for folks who suspect they're autistic or who identify or who have been diagnosed as autistic in
Hmm.
terms of self-discovery? If you could just kind of maybe, I mean, there could be several recommendations that you have, but if there's one thing that you would recommend to them for, self-discovery purposes, what might that be?
I would say to find community, to find other autistics and talk with them. There've been several studies that have shown that that's really been the best support that we found as each other,
Mm,
mostly
yeah,
online. That we don't really have our experience reflected back to us in the media, or in books or in just everyday life. A lot
yeah,
of times we share our experiences and people are like, "Oh, that's weird." And if you see an autistic person on TV or whatever, it's like they're displaying the very parts of themselves that we're hiding. So they're not
Yeah.
very relatable, you know?
Hmm.
So support groups are great, especially if you're struggling. I've set up an online community. It's at neurospicycommunity.com, and we have members
Okay.
from all over the world, and we do support group meetings all week long. And it's just amazing to have people hear you and understand what you're going through and share their stories. And, sometimes it's light and refreshing, and sometimes it's really heavy, but we all have this sense of just this profound sense of relief coming out of there,
Right.
feeling understood in a way that just, we may have people who love us and are fascinated with us and like hearing our experiences, but it's different than having somebody else say, "Oh, it's exactly like that for me," and feeling like you're not an
Hmm.
alien anymore.
Right.
It's really something. So yeah, finding some sense of community. You don't have to come to mine, obviously, but finding some sort of community out there is really important.
Yeah, it's this feeling of I'm not in this alone.
Yes,
I'm kind
exactly.
of we're in the same boat and kind of going through the same type of thing. Well, how can people get your book sold? This The Autistic's Guide to Self-Discovery. How can they, when is it coming out and how can they get
It
this?
it comes out April 22nd, and they can get it through their local bookstore. They can get it online, through the big bookstores. It'll be on audio, on ebook, and in paperback. So you can pre-order it before April 22nd if you're listening to us before then. And so it should be available just about anywhere.
That's great, and I wish you
Yeah,
luck with that. It's a great
thank you.
book, and I think that people should consider ordering this and reading this, especially if they're trying to learn more about themselves and kind of navigate their way through the autistic journey. So I think that's a very
Yeah.
worthwhile resource for them. So, well, thanks for joining me today, Sol, and sharing your thoughts about the book and your experiences as well. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I've appreciated it too. Great conversation.
Okay, have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. You